Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to see us. It's so nice to see so many people and so many familiar places. Our faces. Also a familiar place. My name's Laura, this is Max, obviously, and we're here to tell you the story of our recent circumnavigation of South America, from which we returned in July. So just to give you an idea of what we did, a lot of people like to say that we sailed around the world. Not quite, but we did sail around South America, which is 20,000 nautical miles, whereas to contextualize, if you sailed around the world via the Southern Ocean route, it would be 21,000 miles at 600. The 20,000 miles here, nautical miles of course, don't include all the miles we spent going the wrong way. So I don't know if either of us really know, but this is the route that we took. We visited 12 countries and so many ports that I tried to write them all down the other day and it was pretty much impossible. And somehow we did this all in 365 days, 375 days, leaving from Hideaway Marina in Kingston, returning to Hideaway Marina in Kingston.
All right. So one of the first things, challenges we faced was Laura and I started dating and we came up with this idea that we wanted to do this. We gave ourselves essentially 6 months where we're like, we're not going to talk about sailing trip quite yet. So almost like to the day the 6 months were up and we kind of opened up to like start actually making this happen. And choosing the right boat was like the first thing we had to figure out. Like neither one of us had really done an offshore voyage on our own. So we essentially just started asking friends and family like what kind of boats they would suggest, and started looking them up, researching them a little bit, seeing what there was out there on the market, and kind of just going to visit them. I mean, even if it was way out of our budget or completely neglected, not even something we really wanted, we would go look at it and just try to learn about it. And one of the things we quickly realized was no matter if the boat was out of our budget or not, there was going to be a lot of outfitting that we'd have to do regardless. So we figured we would try to get something on the cheaper side, and that way we'd kind of, we'd have to spend the outfitting money anyway, and maybe we'd save a little bit that way. We eventually gravitated towards a full keel double ender design. The Westsail was one that we chose, and we had talked about it with some friends and family. It seemed like it's a proven hull, it's a proven boat. It's been in all kinds of weather. It was in the Fastnet race. It was the perfect storm. There was one in there that it ended up on shore, but it didn't sink, and they abandoned ship. That's why it ended up on shore. But we looked up online, and it's a very popular boat. There's at least 1,000 in the world, and they're all over the place. But sure enough, the cheapest one for sale was right in the Bronx, and so we went to take a look at it.
I remember really clearly this day. We had seen a lot of boats that were more or less ready to go to sea in very good condition, and none of them really appealed to us for one reason or another. And when we walked down the ramp at Locust Point Marina in the Bronx, and there was just this one lonely boat left in the water way past the season, and we just knew, I knew anyway, maybe I'm being overly romantic about this memory, but I just knew this was the boat. The Westsail has such beautiful lines. In addition to having all of the important safety features that we needed in an offshore boat, like a small cockpit and ability to easily drain water in heavy weather, the Westsail has a really thick keel, it's sturdy, and as a benefit that was important to me is that it's really cozy inside. This particular boat was an absolute mess. As you can sort of see, it was abandoned. And fell into disrepair. And I think that also appealed to us because Max and I like a project, and you could just see that we could have spent more money on a boat that was closer to being ready to go, or spend less money on a boat that really needed to be brought back to life. And this boat was just so beautiful, and we knew that it was fate, that we had to bring this boat back to life. Also, it was really cheap, and because it needed a lot of work. And in addition, it had, because of an insurance settlement, there was a brand new mast and completely new rigging for the boat, which to me was just an incredible bonus. And what we paid for the boat, you might have easily paid just for that new mast and rig. So that was really important to us. Yeah, so then we decided to buy this Westsail, and it kept us safe many times. However, it had a lot of problems, beginning with the engine.
Yeah, so when we bought the boat, essentially the engine was a big question mark. It had motored there based on the seller, and another thing, the seller wasn't the previous owner. The previous owner had had a mental breakdown and moved back to Ireland, and his cousin was selling it. So we were kind of getting everything, hearing things like a game of telephone. It was just his account of what happened. So the boat had motored there. The engine, he said, thought he could work. You ask anyone about an old diesel, and they'll say, yeah, they're indestructible. They'll start. Don't worry about it. So we bought the boat in like mid-November 2014. And by early December, Laura and I, on the weekends, we were driving out there to the Bronx in pretty cold weather and starting to learn about diesel engines, of which we didn't really have much prior knowledge. And we kind of, did some of the obvious things. We started replacing filters, replacing fuel. We bled the engine, bought some new batteries, and started cranking her over and over again, trying to get some kind of, something for it to start. It didn't work out. We eventually hired a mechanic from that was in the neighborhood. He came. He tried the same thing, also to no avail, which was kind of reassuring to us in the end. And he told us that it needed a full rebuild, essentially. So it was, by that point, it was shortly before Christmas. We pulled the engine out of the boat and hauled it up here to the Hudson Valley, to Rhinebeck, across the river, put it at the shop at my parents' house, and that way we had it on a rolling table, and we were able to work on it, like gentlemen and gentlewomen, and we kind of continued the process. So we started pulling the engine apart, and one thing that struck me was, I wasn't sure how it had deteriorated to that extent. I would think it would have broken down way earlier than it did, based on all the different problems it had. But sure enough, we cleaned it up. We bought new parts. We soaked the block in something to clean it all out, and got new pistons, new cylinders, new head gasket, everything. Put it back together again, painted it, and it worked. And I actually have a video of the first time we got it started, which I can show. Yeah. So, unfortunately, you have to unplug back and forth.
While Max gets the video ready, I'll just say that the mechanic who came to visit us quoted us $9,000 to take the engine out of the boat, rebuild it, and bring it back to us. In the end, we did everything ourselves, and it cost $6,000.
Can you guys see it all right up here? Yeah. We'll just continue on. Oh yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So anyway, we spent $6,000 on it. So 6,000 is pretty close to 9,000 in some ways. But the truth is that we took this whole engine apart. Max was much more involved than I was, but together we learned so much about this engine, and I think that's one of the smartest things we did, because no matter where we were during this trip, Max knew every sound, every function of the engine, and every time we had any type of issue, he just knew exactly what to do. He knew where every single thing was, and that was incredibly important to us. Even though we never had trouble with the engine. So then we ran out of gas because we forgot to fill it. Right?
Alright, so another thing that was a good addition, this was, Laura insisted on this one. She didn't like, the boat had come with a cloth dodger, which she wasn't very impressed with. And she kind of convinced me that we needed a hard dodger. and did a little research online and found a cool blog that explained how to make a hard dodger out of the aluminum frame of a soft dodger. And essentially the way it worked is you bought this 16-inch thick fiberglass paneling at Home Depot, which they kind of use in cheap bathrooms. It's got some bubbles on it. You'll see it in cheap bathrooms or in an RV or something. And it's super flexible, and you kind of form it over the aluminum frame and tie it into place with zip ties. And you're essentially creating a mold that you can then lay up fiberglass on top of and build up the thickness. So we started with the 16-inch thick and then just laid fiberglass on top with polyester resin to build it up to a 1/4-inch thick. So, and then by that point, with the aluminum frame below, which you leave in place, it's a pretty rigid structure. So that ended up working really well. You can see there's a picture of Laura. That's like without any fiberglass on top yet. We're just kind of reinforcing the edge, which obviously would be a weak point. And then we cut holes for the windows, installed plexiglass. We had some trouble bending plexiglass, but eventually got it. And if you look on that picture where it's all complete, there's the 2 lights on the side are fixed, and then the front one we actually put a hinge so you could open that, which was pretty nice. And all in all, with paint, plexiglass all included, we spent about $500 on this, and it was priceless throughout the trip to have good shelter, and it also provided a good surface for mounting solar panels later on.
Sure. So the interior was really a disaster. There were things that were simply missing. We didn't have anything in the kitchen. There wasn't a stove. There wasn't really enough compartments to store things. One bunk had been torn out. The nav station was just gone. It looked like the man who owned it before us got started on things and then just didn't finish them. But he also used really cheap materials that kind of clashed with the beautiful wood of the interior. So we got some advice and help from a local carpenter named Terry Baldwin. It's a shame Terry isn't here today, but he gave us a lot of tips on how to build these parts of the boat so that they ended up looking like they originally were there. And so we spent the winter inside the boat at Hideaway Marina. Max's dad is responsible for this lovely kerosene stove sitting on the top there that served us well during the voyage. And in the end, we made a new nav station. We made sure the bunks were to our liking, and really made the boat look wonderful inside. We were able to match the stain of the surrounding wood pretty easily. We had to take the entire ceiling down, which was just individual strips of wood, because the deck was soft, and that took a very long time. And then we had to drill holes in the deck and pump it full of epoxy to make it hard again, and then put the ceiling back up. So we did a lot of work on the interior, and it took that whole winter, but it paid off in the end. Did you want to add anything? Oh, and then we were ready to go. So by this time the boat was ready. You can see how far it came. And this was our Shakedown Cruise, New York to Bermuda, for which we enlisted the help of crew, Max's parents. And we really had a wonderful time, but it was interesting. I mean, when we left, we hadn't sailed this boat very much. I worked till the end of the school year. I didn't know how to reef the main on this boat when we set sail from New York City. So that was a little stressful, and it took 6 days to get to Bermuda, and we endured every type of weather and every point of sail. And that was kind of a gift, because we learned a lot about the boat in that time. We experienced a lot of leaks that were heartbreaking, because we had worked so hard on the boat, but then after a while we just became numb to leaks, basically. And so we had a really good shakedown cruise, but when we got to Bermuda, we had just a week of going back to work on the boat, basically. But a good shakedown cruise.
All right, so one thing that we hadn't figured out before leaving was how we were going to steer the boat for the entire trip, basically. We didn't, you can buy mechanical wind vanes. They cost about $5,000. They need to be installed. It can be tricky installing them, and we didn't really have time or the money for it. And I researched before we left about the self-steering or sheet-to-tiller self-steering system, where you're essentially using a rope that you tie the sail and then connect to the tiller, and that steers the boat. And essentially, the way it works for if there's some sailors out here, you're basically sailing at one point of sail. As the boat falls away from the wind, more pressure builds on the head sail, pulling the tiller so that the boat rounds up into the wind. And if it goes too far, the pressure reduces on the head sail, and the bungee takes over and brings the boat back down. So essentially, you're creating like an S. You're sailing an S pattern in the general direction that you want to go. And it turns out, luckily for us, that this works extremely well on full keel boats. And we sailed almost like essentially the full 20,000 miles. At least whenever we were sailing, we sailed it with this system. And I think like the longest we went without adjusting, usually typically it would take, you'd have to adjust it every 4 to 5 hours. But I think we even went like one stretch of 5 days without touching it. So it worked extremely well. You can kind of, I have some pictures on here where you can kind of see how it's set up. I mean, it might be a little confusing, but there's a line from the mast step that goes to the clew of the head sail, and then you run it back, just however you want to run it back to get it to the cockpit. And then you kind of cross it to the other side of the tiller and hook it onto a cam cleat on the tiller, and then the bungee's on the other side. And they kind of work together. And you can get, there's some tricks to make it easy to adjust, but essentially up here in the corner, that kit, that was like my self-steering kit that could, cost maybe, I don't know, less than $100 to assemble. So that worked out really well for us. So skipping, oh yeah, the video. Yes. Yeah, so I have a little video to show like it in action. I mean, and the cool thing about this video, we actually catch a fish at the end. We have a bite. So wait, you're gonna cut that fish on. I think we lost that fish. All right, skipping ahead a little bit, just to keep it, somewhat short. We eventually got through the Caribbean, went through the Panama Canal, and arrived in the Galapagos. The Galapagos was an important stop for us for several reasons. It was, one of our first Pacific passages, and obviously it's an extremely amazing place to visit. We also started doing some programs with kids, where we sailed with kids a little bit, which is actually part of the reason we were allowed to stop in the Galapagos. We kind of had reached out and happened to talk to an agent that was involved with the school and got us in. It's extremely expensive to stop there with a boat. There's a lot of like government bureaucracy about environmental impact, et cetera, et cetera. But we had a really, really great time. Actually, Laura, you might have more.
Sure. In order to access all the islands in the Galapagos, you have to buy a really expensive permit called an autografo. We decided not to buy that. I'm not sure if I would make that choice again. I think I would buy it. The Galapagos are absolutely incredible. But it was early in the trip, and we were concerned with finances and things like that. So we stayed in just one port in Puerto Ayora in the island of Santa Cruz. And it was just absolutely phenomenal. It's everything you expect the Galapagos to be. The seals walking around in the streets, turtles walking about as well, iguanas swimming around the boat, a pristine environment that's protected by very stringent environmental regulations that we also had to abide by, that were not always easy. We made lots of friends in the Galapagos because of this work program with the kids, which was really fulfilling. And when we were in the Galapagos, we stayed there for 3 weeks, which is pretty unusual to be able to stay there for very long. We were also preparing for the really epic voyage to Easter Island, which we were pretty nervous about. So in the Galapagos, we had to really make sure that the boat was ready and stock it up, which is not very easy in the Galapagos and also fairly expensive. But yeah, we spent 3 weeks there and it was wonderful. And then we set out for a truly daunting section of the trip. I was so worried about this section. because we plan to do two 2,000-mile passages with only a week break in Easter Island. Also, it was the first time Max and I were alone on the boat in the, not the first time we were alone for a passage, but the first time we were alone for an open ocean passage. Just the idea of going out to Easter Island really scared me. But we went out there to avoid the Humboldt Current, which comes, hi Ricky, which comes up the west side of South America. And if you go close to the coast, you have to go slow, you have to use your motor a lot. But if you go out to sea, you can take advantage of the trade winds and sail most of the time. And we had the most pleasant, wonderful passages. And I learned after the Pacific that is not the mileage about a passage that matters whatsoever. 2,000 miles is no big deal when you're in the trade winds in the Pacific and every day is warm. And I'm sorry. And that middle picture I just love. This is one of our happiest days at sea when this gigantic fin whale came up next to us and dove underneath the boat and came up on the other side. We caught lots of tuna. And then we arrived in Easter Island.
Yeah, so another thing like about this trip, Galapagos to Easter Island, you got the southeast trades there, and they're pretty light. They're about 13 knots, and they're on our beam. So we just had basically ideal wind for our boat in a way, and we cruised that straight down. We did that passage in about, I think, 16 days. We arrived in Easter Island shortly after Thanksgiving last year. Or 2016. When we arrived in Easter Island, it's a really beautiful place to visit, but it's not ideal for a boat. You're kind of on a rock in the middle of the Pacific, so you have lots of swell. When you check in with the Chilean authorities, they tell you there's a rule you have to have someone on the boat 24/7, which we just laughed at them with regard to that rule, because the idea of spending a full day on the boat at anchor there was just ridiculous. We could barely sleep on the boat given the swell. So we just ignored that rule. We'd come back in the evening and the boat would be a complete mess from everything getting thrown all over the place. But we'd enjoyed ourselves on land. And then the passage from Easter Island was interesting because, that's when we crossed 40 degrees south, which is where you enter the notorious roaring 40s. And we had my father, we were in constant text contact. He was kind of guiding us along. You have to the north, you have like the Atlantic or a South Pacific high, which is like a no-wind, good weather zone. And then to the south is, the roaring 40s, where one depression after another rolls through. So he did a really good job of navigating us between those two systems. We could sometimes literally look to the left and see nice weather, look to the right and see, terrible weather, and we just skated along, and we ended up making that passage 2,100 miles in 17 days, which was extremely fast. We spoke to a lot of sailors where it took 30 or whatever, and they had crazy gales and stuff, and we didn't experience that at all. And it was interesting too, because we essentially went from the equator, so 0 degrees, all the way to I think 42 south is where we ended up. So we started, instead of catching yellowfin tuna, we were catching albacore, and then we started seeing the giant albatross, and we could really see everything change in front of us. So it was a really a magical 2 passages.
During that time, we were really preparing for our entrance to the Chilean Fjords, which is really what this trip was all about. And there, as you can see, the southern coast of Chile is just a labyrinth of islands and fjords that are difficult to navigate, a pretty dangerous area. But during the passage from Easter Island to Chile, we started, I started, Max too, but me more obsessively, poring over this book of anchorages in the Chilean Fjords, which I brought as a visual. This was written by an Italian couple who spent a decade in the fjords, and it details every single, maybe not every single anchorage, but about 400. And it divides up the coast into different sections so you can map out where you're going to anchor as you move south. So we entered the Chilean Fjords at Chiloé, which is up at the top there. And our first obstacle was to go through Canal Chaco, which is known for its incredibly fast tides and also the dangerous swell at the opening. But man, when we entered Canal Chaco, it was a fabulous day. We got in there right at sunset and managed to pull around the corner and anchor. And it's one of the best feelings in life to spend weeks at sea and then finally pull around a corner into flat waters and drop anchor and go to sleep together for as long as you need to. And then the next day we rode the tide through Canal Chaco, surrounded by seals, species of dolphin we had never seen, into Chiloé at the northernmost area, which is called one of the most beautiful cruising grounds in the world. And it really is. There are volcanoes everywhere, and it's just so beautiful. So that's how we started in the Chilean Fjords. And Max's parents and his sister came to visit us just after Christmas that year. So it was a really celebratory time.
Yeah, so the canals are kind of, it's about 1,000 miles from, you're at like 42 south, and then Cape Horn's about 56 south. And they change a lot. So what Laura was mentioning before, the Chiloé area, which is up here, is one of like the most beautiful cruising grounds in the world for sure. It's also still populated, so you have all these little villages, like houses on stilts, very beautiful little spots. There's a lot of fishing going on, so you can buy shellfish by the kilo, super cheap, and wine is cheap there, so you boil everything in just white wine, pure white wine, and it tastes amazing. And it's really incredible there. And then once you start heading down past the island, you start going into like no man's land essentially. Like the best way to describe like this section is if someone like flooded the Adirondacks and you sailed through it. It's absolutely amazing. And then the problem is once you get to the bottom of that section, you have a big gulf where you actually have to go out to sea again before you can continue in the canals. And Laura was always stressing out about that. There's a video of her as we were about to do that passage where she describes it pretty well. So I'll put that.
So Laura, tell us what we're doing here today.
So we're about to cross the Gulf of Penas, which is a little bit farther south than we are now. And for those of you who don't know, it's a 50-mile bay, a gulf, that is notorious for the huge waves because it shoals very quickly, and the high winds of the area because it's open to the South Pacific systems that roll through. And even though it's 50 miles across, you have to go way out to sea to get around that big chop. So it's more like 100 miles from anchorage to anchorage. And we were going to do it in a couple of days, but we left this morning from a place a little bit farther north, and everything seemed to suggest that it might be safer just to go for it now and sail through the night tonight and arrive around Gulf of Penas, the southern part of it, tomorrow, and deal with whatever swell and chop that we find on our way in. It's going to be windy tonight, which is good for us because there's big waves and we need the wind to get through the waves. So that's what we decided to do, and we put up the staysail and rigged the storm trysail in case we need it. And we have the self-steering system now working. And in a lot of ways, it feels a lot safer and more peaceful out here than it does navigating through the fjords or close to the coast, which is just a nightmare with the amounts of fog and rocks absolutely everywhere. So in 24 hours, we might even have arrived at our southern anchorage after Gulf of Penas, which would be awesome because we've been talking about it for ages and stressed out about it forever and ever, and it would be cool to just have it done.
Cool. Well, there you have it. The story of our Gulf of Penas passage. And right now it's really beautiful. You see everything, Selfsteering working.
we have the boat set up for ocean sailing. First time in a long time. So Laura was really funny. She was waking up in the middle of the night screaming Gulf of Panas before that. But we made it, it was fine. The thing is, once you get past Gulf of Panas, you enter Canal Messier, and essentially this section from Gulf of Panas down to Magellan Strait, the weather takes a serious turn for the worse. Like, you can essentially expect a storm to roll through every 3 to 4 days, and it's rough. And go figure, we arrived in arrived in Canal Messier, and a day or two later, our depth sounder stopped working. So we had a far way to go without a depth sounder. But to just show you how good this book is written, it was fine. It wasn't a big deal. We find the anchorage where we have to go. There's little charts in there of the anchorage, each one, and you kind of navigate that way. We would just assume that their depths were correct, drop our anchor accordingly, and we made it fine.
Well, also, Max made me one of those old style Mark Twain sort of depth sounders with knots in the rope and a diving lead on the bottom. But it's true that if the book said it was 10 meters, it was, it was. But the amazing part about those fjords is it's really, really deep anchorages. So once you get there, you're just beginning your work. And by the way, when we were traveling through the fjords for 8 weeks, we anchored every single night in a different fjord, almost all the time. Unless there was bad weather, we would almost move every single day and find a new a nook or a cranny where we could stow the boat.
Yeah, and so shortly after we arrived in Canal Messier, which is down here, we kind of made a little bit of a mistake and started sailing during one of those storms, and we had a pretty wild time coming down Canal Messier, which is essentially the width of the Hudson, and we did about 60 miles one day, bare poled, and I have this video of it's kind of just a time-lapse photo.
Yeah, we chose the Doors song "Strange Days" because that's exactly what it felt like. It's really strange down there. It's like being on another planet. And there are really steep mountains on either side, and we could see the famous willy walls of the Patagonian fjords sort of forming up top and coming down. And a willy wall is it's like a microburst of wind that can reach up to 100 miles an hour that comes down from the Andes, and it just rips down a steep face. And we were always really worried about them. But the truth is, you can see them. They're right there, like little wispy sort of tornadoes that come down. All that day we could see them. And we didn't have the sails up this whole day, just flying down the canal. It was a very unpleasant experience. It really was.
Another funny thing about down there is, especially right here where you start at Canal Messier, and apparently everyone has this problem, starting from Canal Messier to the Magellan Straits, all the charts are approximately off by 1 mile to the east. So you're looking at your GPS and you're on the mountain and the canal's over there, so it's kind of absurd. So that was that day. We were trying to figure that out, and it'd get a little foggy, and we'd be like, I think this is the right way. We kind of hold a straight line. And that was the last time Laura let me sail in that kind of thing.
It's true, because the thing about the Chilean fjords is the weather is terrible, but if you have patience, you can wait it out. And if you anchor well in a good spot, you can stay there for as many days as you need to, and you can sail only during favorable conditions if you're patient enough. There were certain times in our trip that we weren't patient enough, and every time we paid for it.
Yeah. So, going back to the map. So another cool thing about this area, there's a huge glacial system, a huge glacier called Campo de Hielo that comes down to the water at several spots, which is also extremely spectacular. And there's another little video we can show of going up to one of those. Unfortunately, it wasn't the nicest day, but you can kind of see what that's like. There's icebergs. We actually, after a few hours after this, we weren't paying very much attention, and we almost hit an iceberg. So yeah, it was, I mean, that's pretty amazing. Alright, you guys get the idea. Alright, so, oh yeah, I can do one more of what it's like down there. This kind of goes back to what I said about the Adirondacks. This is like a quick time lapse that we did. Just imagine like how beautiful it is there. It's absolutely incredible.
And keep in mind that there were animals absolutely everywhere. Penguins everywhere, seals all around us. As I said before, species of dolphin that are specific to a certain fjord. And the book says if there's a special dolphin in the fjord, so I made sure we hit all those fjords. But it's just the most pristine environment. It seems untouched by man. But at the same time, some of our personal heroes as sailors were down that way. So we knew that we were following the steps of great people like Joshua Slocum and Hal Roth and all those people, but it felt very much like we were alone. This is actually in the north in Chilean. In the upper right-hand corner is the place where we first landed in the fjords. It's near Puerto Montt, as a seal that hung out on the dock every day. And then Osorno, a volcano down that way. So that's in the north where it's a little bit greener and more civilized.
So yeah, here's some more photos. I mean, this was another glacier we went to that was pretty spectacular. Up on the right there, that's actually Laura and I at Cape Horn when we finally made it down there. And I don't know, this is like a little village that we came across. Some more photos. Yeah.
This is a place called Puerto Santo Domingo that was absolutely incredible because as you moved in, you came in, you could only see that rock on the right, and then the landscape just opens up, and all of a sudden there's a volcano or a waterfall or a mountainscape that you just couldn't imagine that was around that bend. And this always reminds me of the quintessential experience of sailing in Patagonia, where the landscape just keeps opening to something more and more incredible. I think that rock face right there was 800 meters high, I'm pretty sure. It's a big landscape.
So one thing that we figured would be worth mentioning, when you're down there, anchoring is extremely important. So just like some things that might sound ridiculous to those people that sail like anchor around here, down there I wouldn't take any shortcuts if you're planning on going down there when it comes to anchoring. Definitely bring at least 300 feet of chain. We had a manual windlass, so we would take turns in the morning bringing that up every day, which is a lot of work. And then you want about at least 600 feet of polypropylene line as stern lines. So we essentially sewed 2 bags that we hung on the stern pulpit and stuffed with 300 feet each. And what you do with those is you basically, you set the front anchor and then you launch the dinghy and you take those lines and you tie them back to shore in like a triangular pattern. So that keeps you well tucked in, and it's good. You have to make a rule to do that every single night, because before you know it, you'll get caught in like, the wind will pipe up in the middle of the night and it's blowing like crazy, and you'll be happy if it's dark that you did that in the afternoon. Some other things, we highly recommend a rockna or a spade anchor. A serrated knife on a pole, like duct tape to a pole for cutting kelp, which tends to foul the anchors. And beware of any areas where there's no trees. You can that's where these like crazy gusts come through. So you want to like anchor near wooded areas, especially in like valleys that point north-south versus east-west where the winds come from. And then I have just to kind of show the anchoring, I have a video of where you can kind of see what we did, and it was a pretty windy day. And you can see like kind of the boat getting nailed from the side. Not sure if there's any sound. But
Yeah, and you can't see it that clearly, but on the right there's a line on the stern to the shore here, and that's what's keeping the boat from going into those rocks. You can see the slack line there to hold the other side. We spent 2 days in this little area waiting out an opportunity to go into the Straits of Magellan, for which you have to go around a really dangerous spot, I think called Isla Tamar. and the wind was just too heavy, so we had to wait a couple days before we could go in there.
So yeah, and so eventually we got down to the Canal Beagle, and we stayed. First of all, the Beagle Canal has like a little microclimate. All of a sudden you get there and the weather improves a little bit, and it's actually really calm and beautiful. It can be blowing like above 60 knots at Cape Horn and be like 20 knots in the Beagle Channel. It's relatively common. So it's really nice there. We could have stayed there a whole year. I mean, it was incredible there. And then, but it was eventually time to leave to head north again. We ended up leaving on the 14th of March. We had 7,000 miles to go back home. And we were trying to beat the hurricane season. So we wanted to head to the Falklands as like an obvious stepping stone. There's a few problems with that though. One is like a geopolitical issue with Argentina. Argentina claims the Falklands, though it's controlled by the British. So they want you to ask for permission to go there. But like government agencies sometimes tend to do, they're a little slow in responding, so it would take like 2 months before they responded. So we didn't really have the time to wait for that. We decided to do like half and half. We asked for permission and then leave before they gave us the okay. And the next problem was that it takes 4 days to sail to the Falklands from where we were. And the weather window that you tend to have is 3 days. So we had an idea to head as far east as we possibly could, anchor, and kind of follow on the heels of a storm, follow it out, and then we'd make it into the Falklands just in time before the next one. At least that was, in theory, what we wanted to do. It didn't really work out that way. We left and it was fine. It was blowing strong. It was like 30 knots. We started heading south along Tierra del Fuego and Isla de los Estados. Everything was okay. Then when we kind of, a little bit after, when we were kind of even with Isla de los Estados, the wind started picking up, not letting down. We ended up in like a force 9 gale situation. It was like 50, gusts in the lower 50s. The water starts lifting off the surface of the water, and it kind of starts spraying. It was about 35 degrees outside. It was really, really, really cold. Like if you look at the Beaufort scale, it says the sea begins to roll. I always wonder what that meant, but it becomes obvious quickly. Right? Sections of waves that are breaking that are several lengths of the boat, and like leaving large swaths of white water. So there's a great moment with Laura again, where she explains what she's feeling at that moment. This was before it got really bad, but it's pretty.
We just got hit by a huge wave.
Are you cold? Are you tired?
This ship to calm down. Yeah, I feel like it's getting worse. My sensitivity. I'm not reading it.
Tonight, but like, you know what I mean?
No, it's okay.
Come back up and then we'll. So I had to stop filming because the wave was about to hit Laura in the face. It was pretty amazing. So like basically what we ended up doing, that you can see in that video, the self-steering was still steering. Eventually the self-steering, it did pretty well in strong winds, but eventually it was losing control as it was heading down the wave. It would kind of, round up too much. At that point we decided to heave to for a while. which is like a heavy weather maneuver where you stall the boat and you can actually go below and rest. So we actually fell asleep for a while and then woke up to an extremely loud bang. We got like a wave hit the boat in one way or another. I had thought that we had gotten that hard Dodger ripped off. We looked outside and I was surprised to see that it was still there. There was actually like a crate of onions that had gone flying across. And then we decided to start sailing again. But you know, I was at the tiller and we basically just kept the boat, you know, take the waves at the rear quarter and you know, one at a time. And the nice thing, our boat was very beamy and heavy, so it never got to the point where it was, you know, going faster than the waves and pitch pull, you know, or running into the trough. So like, we were always, the waves were passing us. We never were at risk of pitch pulling in the base of a trough. So that's that can be a risk if you have a more modern, lighter boat. So that was a benefit for sure.
Okay, so after the gale ended, there was a beautiful day of pretty calm weather, and we were very excited to be alive. And we really were. I mean, when there was a moment there when we both said, "This is what it feels like to die at sea." I mean, that video is before it got worse, in my defense. But then we had a pretty peaceful day, and the fourth day we could see the Falklands. We were so excited. But we just couldn't get there because a really nasty headwind piped up, and then it took us the entire day to pull into the Port Stanley in the Falklands. We didn't pull in until 10 p.m. that evening, and we were exhausted. I mean, really, really exhausted and pretty sick of sailing. And also I knew we were only going to be in the Falklands for about a week before we did another really daunting passage all the way to Brazil. But we had a fantastic time that week. We met a crew of pretty impressive sailors from, the captain was from Belgium. Actually, this boat right now, Le Grand Jacques is the name of the boat. They just went to Antarctica and came back. And they were just really fun to be around. They were young sailors. They had come through the same gale coming down from the north, and the captain had broken a couple ribs. Their Genoa had been ripped right off the boat. So they had a much rougher time in that storm than we did. But the two boats, we were next to each other, we celebrated, we ate a lot of lamb together. Max and I drank a lot of beer and ate a lot of fish and chips. And then we took one day to really tour the Falklands and go see the penguins. The rest of the day we were just, you know, always getting the boat ready for the next passage. So I think we left 6 days later after we landed in the Falklands. And we started on our arduous journey to Brazil, which was only a 1,400-mile journey, but it took us a very long time because the Southern Atlantic is not nearly as hospitable as the South Pacific. So it took a really long time, but eventually we arrived back in tropical waters, and that was a really good feeling. And we had some friends meet us. These pictures are of Il Grande, which is a group of islands near Rio de Janeiro, where it's a popular destination spot, but it's also just the easiest cruising ground. There's basically nothing you have to worry about. And that just felt like such a relief after all our time in the Southern Ocean. So there we are in Brazil, and at this point it felt like we were almost home, but Brazil's actually pretty far away, so we weren't exactly home yet.
Yeah, so I mean, we ended up kind of hopping up the Brazilian coast. My parents joined us again for a long passage from Brazil to the Caribbean, which was another 2,000 miles. One really cool thing about that part of the trip was you kind of pass the area where the Amazon comes into the Atlantic, so there's like a lot of nutrients in the water, and the fishing there is unreal. Like it was like 10 minutes and you got a mahi this size. I mean, it was absolutely insane. We got 2 of those. Oh yeah. We caught 2 that like in that picture, and you know, we ended up, you know, getting to Barbados fine, and then Laura and I stayed in the Barbados for a while, and then made the sail straight up to the Hudson. And I think we arrived in New York Harbor July 10th, which was 375 days after we had left New York Harbor the year earlier. And this is literally the pictures from our last day, literally, you know, within a few hours of, you know, hideaway marina here, or the roundup. And so we made it back. And that's it. That's all we had.